Thank you all for attending. My name's Neil Jock. I'm the host of this series, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to hear Michael Krepon today. You can obviously hear me without the use of this mic, but we need to use the mic for the recording so that they have a full necessary sound effect. So it's kind of a Potemkin mic, but we'll work with it as is. So I'm very pleased to welcome Michael Krepon from Washington, co-founder of the Stimson Center, currently an independent scholar, both working for Stimson and doing a lot of work. Michael's a good example of sort of the policy insider. He hasn't been involved as a policy maker for a while. He was back in some decades ago, I dare say. But he's been working on the inside of how people think about policy in Washington for several decades and understands the makings of policy and comes to us with some very interesting thoughts about the issue of space competition with China. I encourage you to look at his testimony from last week when he testified in front of the House Armed Services Committee. It's available on the web, January 28th, 2014, so it was just last week that he gave his testimony. And you can also find additional thoughts from people who take a counter view to Michael's at the same time that also testified. Not an advertisement for them since I'm being a good host, but in any case, I also encourage you to take a look at a couple of books he's done, most recently Deterrence, Stability, and Escalation Control in South Asia, which speaks to another of Michael's areas of interest. This is a book he edited. And then perhaps more interestingly, his single-authored book, Better Safe Than Sorry, The Ironies of Living with the Bomb. But I think these capture Michael's expansive attention to policy issues and help sort of put in perspective a practitioner and observer and scholar who's been sitting in Washington looking at policies developed for several decades now and is, I think, uniquely positioned based on his intellect and policy acumen to provide us, to write these books. So thank you for those. And with that said, let me turn things over to Michael Krepon. Michael, thank you for joining us in Berkeley.
Thank you, Neil. You know, you're very, very fortunate here at Berkeley because you have people available to you who have been in the arena. They've tried to make policy. They've tried to inform policy from both the intelligence community and State Department, National Security Council's staff, the Pentagon. So there are two guys here in the room who are just immensely talented. And they're here. So why not bother them? Neil, I don't know if you know his background, but he came from Lawrence Livermore. He's worked in the State Department policy planning. He's worked on the NSC staff. He's worked in the intelligence community as the National Intelligence Officer for South Asia. So that's the go-to person for South Asia and Afghanistan, by the way. So he's over here. And his office is right down the hall. And Michael Nacht is here at Berkeley. And Michael has, he's worked on everything I'm about to talk about. And he knows more about everything I'm going to talk about than I do. And he's been at the Pentagon. He was at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He's negotiated with the Chinese. He's negotiated with the Soviets. So bother him, too, if you have questions about these matters. It's good to be back at Berkeley. I was here as a student in the summer of 1969. And my hair was longer then than it is now. So let's talk about space. Let's talk about China. Let's talk about how a status quo power that depends very greatly on space deals with a rising power that is increasing its capabilities in space across the board. So a lot of people are worrying about China. China is flexing its muscles a little bit more. Earlier last year, a Chinese battalion set up camp 7 miles across the line of actual control, dividing India and China, and just set up tents for 3 weeks. That was very upsetting to New Delhi. And China's naval capabilities are growing, and we are seeing some of the same dynamics vis-a-vis China that we saw with the Soviet Union way back when I was a student at Berkeley in the late 60s, where there are close encounters between naval vessels. There is a real possibility that hulls will scrape. And this worries some people. And not just in the United States, but friends of ours in the region and neighbors of China. And then China has a very active space program across the board. You've read about a moon landing. Not everybody is able to do that, to have a rover explore the surface of the moon. You've probably read in the papers or on the internet that China carried out a successful test in blowing up one of its old satellites, which created quite a debris field, which is a hazard to every spacefaring nation. And they're also testing multi-purpose technologies, as are we, that could be applied for military purposes, or they could be used for very benign purposes. So what is China up to? And can we and China work out a cooperative as well as a competitive relationship without getting into a fracas in space? That's what I want you to think about. The United States, unlike China, has some experience in how to manage a cooperative and competitive relationship in space. We did it with a peer competitor, not with a rising power. Maybe that made it a little bit easier. But we and the Soviets engaged in a space race to get to the moon, to land humans on the moon. We engaged in a ferocious nuclear arms competition, just ferocious. Between the two of us, we produced, Berkeley also has something to do with this, but we produced over 70,000 nuclear warheads in this competition. Think about that. It far outweighs the competition we're looking at with China, particularly in the nuclear dimension. But it was an ideological competition. It was a geopolitical competition. We're competing with China in a region. We competed with the Soviet Union everywhere. We had very, very, very close encounters with nuclear danger with the Soviet Union. We had crises that some people in this room lived through. And we also competed on the global commons of the high seas and in space. We didn't have that cyber thing going on back then, but we had just about all the rest of it. And we somehow worked out rules of the road for space. We cooperated as well as competed. We had the docking of a US and a Soviet spaceship in 1975, Apollo Soyuz. We cooperate with Russia to this day, every day, on the International Space Station. And, you know, our relations with Russia aren't so good in other areas, but we do cooperate in space. We avoided a surprise attack, which a lot of people worried about, in space. We avoided a bolt out of the blue attack, which a lot of people worried about in terms of our nuclear competition. Some people today talk about a space Pearl Harbor. How do we prevent a space Pearl Harbor with China? We are so dependent on space. Our military is so dependent on space. When we move forces into harm's way, those forces get help from space. When those forces need to communicate, they get help from space. If those forces need to target somebody or something on the surface of the Earth, they get help from space. If they need a weather forecast, which is crucial when you're operating in strange lands, you get help from space. So we are so dependent on space. And you are, who are not in the military, are so dependent on space. Are we vulnerable in space? Absolutely. Are we vulnerable to nuclear attack? You bet. And somehow we have managed to avoid being attacked despite our vulnerabilities. So far. So how, if lessons learned, how did we manage to avoid this surprise attack and being disadvantaged from an attack on our assets in space? Well, one reason we managed to avoid this dreadful outcome is because we and our opponent, back in the Cold War days, our peer competitor, we managed to accept, we didn't like it, but we accepted the fact that we were vulnerable in space. We accepted the fact that if either one of us messed with the other guy's satellites, we could expect something similar in return. Second reason, we accepted, and the Soviets accepted, the concept that we could not wall off fighting in space from fighting elsewhere. Because our military forces and our nuclear forces were joined at the hip with assets in space. So the possibility, indeed the probability, of uncontrolled escalation was acknowledged. Vulnerability, possibility of escalation that could not be controlled by national leaders. Those were two really big factors. There was another really big factor, and that is that we and the Soviets possessed all kinds of capabilities to mess with each other in space if the need arose. We did not need dedicated capabilities to kill or injure satellites. We could borrow capability that was designed for some other reason. So if you had a ballistic missile of sufficient range, and you could track objects in space, and both we and the Soviets had these capabilities, you could do damage. you could do severe damage. And we learned early on in this competition that the damage we could do, if need be, could have long-lasting and unexpectedly negative effects. I'll give you an example. And this is a pop quiz, and I think there may be a couple of people in this room who remember a top 40 instrumental hit called Telstar. Am I getting any positive feedback here on Telstar, the instrumental? Maybe not. Oh, there's somebody, okay. Telstar was a broadcast satellite, one of the very first ones. And it excited a lot of people because it allowed the first direct broadcast from Europe to be shown on our television sets. And so we could see all these fabulous British bands that were coming up. This was in 1962. And in 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union were still testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. And one of our tests was a pretty powerful one, and it killed Telstar, the satellite. And it killed 5 other satellites. There weren't many up there at that time. They weren't all ours. So we learned early on that, yeah, we could mess up satellites in low Earth orbit with a nuclear detonation, but the effects would be indiscriminate. We couldn't control the effects, and it could blow back on us. Another example, much later, during the Reagan administration, when the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union had ramped up, the United States conducted an anti-satellite test. So, like the Chinese did in 2007, a very old satellite wasn't worth very much anymore. And we tested hit-to-kill technology, kinetic energy destruction of a satellite. And this is really not, you don't need too many tests to demonstrate that capability. You may not get it right the first time, but you'll get it right if you are a major spacefaring nation. And we did a test back then of one of our satellites. Now, back then, our tracking capabilities weren't as good as they are now. So we're not exactly sure how many pieces of debris resulted from that test. But we do know that one of those pieces of debris nearly killed the newly launched International Space Station 14 years later. Now, the space station, on average, gets maneuvered out of the way of a piece of debris once a year, on average. Lately, the debris that we're dodging is from the Chinese test in 2007, which created a horrific debris field. And unfortunately, it was pretty high up, so we have to wait decades more for this to clear out. There are 200 satellites below that test. So we learned during the Cold War that we were vulnerable. We couldn't escape vulnerability, except at the margins. And we certainly couldn't escape vulnerability to somebody who really wanted to do us harm and was willing to accept the consequences. We understood that. The Soviets understood it. We understood that certain kinds of activities in space would cause long-lasting, indiscriminate effects, which we wish to avoid, and they wish to avoid. And yet we retained the capability to do serious damage because it was part and parcel of our nuclear deterrent, as well as other multi-purpose military capabilities that we could apply to space if the need arose. So we managed to compete and cooperate with the Soviet Union in space. Can we manage to compete and cooperate with a rising China in space? I think it's fair to assume that if we and China have a significant crisis, or indeed the risk of military conflict, it will probably happen in a global commons. It's not going to be on the Chinese landmass. I don't think it's going to be, I don't see it happening vis-a-vis Taiwan. But it could well happen at sea, could happen in space, could happen with cyber. On the one hand, our satellites and the Chinese satellites are as vulnerable, if not more vulnerable today, than the US and Soviet satellites were back then. Back then, you know, we had some ballistic missile defenses for a short period of time. Now we have a lot of ballistic missile defense capability, and it's growing. And it's not just in the continental United States, it's also at sea, and it's in forward deployed areas. Because our friends and allies are looking for some reassurance, and ballistic missile defenses serve that purpose. By the way, they could also be applied against satellites. So that part is the same. Cold War today, vulnerability is the same. The retention of capability to do damage to each other is the same. In fact, it's probably greater than it was back then. What we don't understand, and which is crucial to understand, is whether or not the Chinese leadership will reach the same conclusions as the Soviet leadership reached about the possibility of uncontrolled escalation, the red lines, the sensitivities. Remember, the Chinese political leadership, they're neophytes when it comes to jostling with a major power. I mean, we and the Soviets regrettably did it more than once. But the Chinese leadership, this is going to be a new game for them. Some people in this room, Michael especially, will remember that when we first started negotiating with the Soviet Union on nuclear arms control, there were some real disconnects between the Kremlin leadership and the Soviet General Staff and the strategic rocket forces. They weren't on the same page. And indeed, we had reason to question whether the Kremlin leadership had strong understandings of Soviet military doctrine and test practices and operations and the possibility of things going haywire. When we first started talking to the Soviets about their strategic capabilities, the Soviet General Staff would take the U.S. negotiator aside and say, "Hey, you're not supposed to say these things. They're secrets." So what we don't know now, but which many people suspect, is that there isn't the best understanding between the party leadership, government leaders, and the military leadership. That's one good thing that negotiations can do for you. It kind of forces different parts of a government to get together and talk to one another, and it forces them to sit down with the military leadership and work out a negotiating position. But there are no negotiations in the offing with China on nuclear stuff or on space. There seems to be the same deep reluctance on the part of the PLA leadership to engage the United States as there was with the Soviet General Staff way back in the 60s. The PLA seems to think that they're playing catch-up ball, that if they engage with the United States, they will lose the advantage of secrecy. And if they do a deal with the United States, they may seal themselves into a position of inferior capability. So we don't have the forcing function of negotiations with China to try and get a good read on their sensibilities, their sensitivities, what are they thinking about? Do they understand if they mess with our satellites that all hell could break loose? Do they view it as a freebie? It would be good to have these conversations. There is a strategic and economic dialogue between the United States and China. It's now been institutionalized, I think, but it's not, the subjects of nuclear and space, Michael can correct me on this, I don't think they figure very prominently in this dialogue. Is that a fair? Not at all. So I was being polite. Michael says not at all. So we don't have that channel to open things up a bit. The United States and our European friends are supportive of something called a code of conduct for responsible spacefaring nations. In fact, the European Union, which is taking the lead, has actually drafted several versions of this code of conduct. And you can access it easily enough on the internet. We have codes of conduct for the global commons of the high seas with the Soviet Union / Russia. Other countries have reached a similar type of agreement. We call it the Incidents at Sea Agreement. It was negotiated way back in 1972 after we had all of these close calls on and under the water. And you can look up the Incidents at Sea Agreement to see what kind of provisions there are. We have a similar set of understandings with Moscow for dangerous military practices involving ground forces and air forces operating in close proximity. There are no rules of the road, so to speak, for space. None. Well, that's an exaggeration. There is an outer space treaty that was signed way back in 1967. That's the last significant treaty, perhaps the only significant treaty that has been negotiated for space. It has some rules. You're not supposed to use weapons of mass destruction in space. But all the weapons I've been talking to you about, the hit-to-kill technologies, or lasers, or jammers, or whatever, ballistic missile defense interceptors, that's not weapons of mass destruction. No rules. Space is getting pretty crowded in some places. Crowded with satellites and crowded with debris. We are close to having dead zones in space, in the same way that we have dead zones in the ocean now. The dead zones in space would be the result of debris. And the more collisions there are in space, the greater the likelihood that there will be dead zones. We need a traffic management system for space. None of you would even be able to get on an airplane to fly across an ocean without a traffic management system and handoffs and warnings of collisions. But we don't have a traffic management system for space. We've got the beginnings of one. We need a debris mitigation system for space. If we keep every launch that goes up, for whatever reason, is going to create debris. We can't stop that. But we can stop certain practices in space that are hugely debris creating, including these tests. So a code of conduct provides consultative measures, it provides debris mitigation measures, it provides the beginnings, I think, of a traffic management system, but that's going to take a long time. China and Russia have proposed a hugely ambitious and unverifiable treaty for space, which does not stop them from developing space warfare capabilities, including ASAT systems, anti-satellite systems. This treaty is not going anywhere. But recently, last fall, in fact, for the first time, Moscow and Beijing have said they agree in principle to the notion of a code of conduct for space. They don't agree yet to the specific language that the Europeans and the US and Japan and a bunch of other spacefaring nations have already said we can live with this. It's okay for us. So, how do we get this code of conduct to become a reality? How do we set norms for responsible behavior in space? Because we don't have treaties to do this. And treaties are unlikely. Codes of conduct are the way to go to set rules of the road. Now, without rules, there are no rule breakers in space. But even if you do have rules, it's no guarantee that everybody's going to play by the rules. But you have more of a basis to deal with rule breakers when you have rules. Is this code of conduct going to happen anytime soon? Is it going to happen during the Obama administration? I don't know. For it to happen, the Obama administration has to make it a high priority, and it has a lot of high priorities. It has to use embarrassment. If you are a responsible spacefaring nation, why not sign up to these rules? It does not have inducements. That's a problem, in my view. There aren't a whole lot of inducements. China has to do this for its own reasons, not because it's getting something from the United States. And for China to sign up, then the party leadership, the government leaders, have to turn to the PLA and say, we want this. This is a good thing to do. Are they ready to do that? I'm not counting it out, but so far I don't see that willpower. So that's where we are. There's a lot in motion here. Friction between a status quo power and a rising power, it's on the table. The utilization of space for wonderful purposes, as well as military purposes, that's on the table. Civil-military relations and their evolution in China, that's on the table. So I hope I've given you something to think about. Thank you for your attentiveness.
Thank you very much, Michael. Before I turn to the floor for questions, let me just make a couple of comments, a couple of announcements. We always have a little reception after these seminars to allow people to meet with each other a little informally or to descend on the speaker and ask questions that they didn't get to ask from the floor, or as is often the case, the speaker doesn't fully answer the question. I'm sure that won't be the case here, but it allows you then to probe a little bit more with the speaker and also to have a glass of wine and some snacks before dinner. The second thing is this is part of the Institute of International Studies U.S. Foreign Policy series. Michael's our first speaker for the year and for the spring semester. The next scheduled speaker, and there may be others, but the next scheduled speaker is Victor Cha, who will be speaking about North Korea. Victor will be coming here on April 8th, a Tuesday. Our normal days, we try and have these on Thursdays, but he'll be here on Tuesday, April 8th, again at 4 o'clock in this room to talk about North Korea and the challenges that presents for U.S. foreign policy. So with that said, let me open the floor up and take questions for anyone who would like to speak up. And I'm going to pass the microphone around again, not for our benefit inside the room, but rather for the recording. And for those who watch recordings, it's always frustrating when someone asks a question from the floor, and first you don't know who it is, and second you don't know what they said. So be patient while I bring the microphone to you, and I'll start all the way in the back. And if you wouldn't mind, please identify yourself, both for the record and also for the rest of us in the room. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this very informative talk. I'm Yu Tianxin from Geography here on campus. I have two questions. First, I would like to hear more about how you describe the collaborative relationship between the U.S. and Soviet Union during the Cold War, during the 60s and 70s. Exactly what's the content of those collaboration? So that's one thing that I'm very curious about and very intrigued by, because of your comments. And secondly, I wonder what would be your comments on not just U.S. government, but the private capital in the U.S. in their competition, in space, especially in the moon. For all, I've heard that even in Silicon Valley here, they got this rare earth, drive and imagination, or in sometimes in actual real practices, trying to get something from there. So I'm just wondering, how would that play into this equation about foreign policy? But now we have the private capital also rather anxious in doing that.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. The primary vehicle for cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union was our manned space programs. And anyone who's been in space, I have never been to space, but everyone who has comes back a little changed. sometimes a lot changed. And there is a bond between those who have explored the cosmos. And this was a natural way for us to develop a cooperative relationship alongside the competitive one. And when President Nixon went to Moscow in 1972 to sign some treaties, important agreements, for the first, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the treaty that basically said we are going to accept mutual vulnerability. And he also signed a companion agreement, the first one to limit or slow the growth of our nuclear forces and Soviet nuclear forces. At that summit, he signed an agreement with Brezhnev to have our astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts meet in space and have a handshake in space. So it took 3 years to arrange this. It was not so simple because we were developing our spacecraft quite separately. And we had to figure out how to do this properly and safely. And that handshake symbolized quite a lot. It did not prevent subsequent intensification of our competition. But it did have a dampening effect for space. And it led to the cooperation to this day. You know, the International Space Station has a cosmonaut and an astronaut on it all the time. And we were dependent until very recently on Russia for supply vehicles to the space station. So that was the cooperation. And NASA and its counterpart in the Soviet Union were crucial in developing this pathway to cooperation. The Congress has passed this current omnibus appropriation bill and previous, I think the previous two Congresses have said to the Obama administration, you cannot have NASA engage with China on any bilateral matter. So we don't now have this opportunity with China to cooperate in our spacefaring ventures, at least not in a bilateral way. There still could be some very interesting projects, science projects, environmental monitoring projects, monitoring the power coming off the sun that can create havoc to our instruments here on Earth. There are still some projects that we might pursue with China in a multilateral way that could help. But right now, it's forbidden by the Congress to do so bilaterally.
So you mentioned multilateral Oh, hi. I'm Mary Steiner with the United Nations Association of the East Bay, and wondered what you meant by multilateral possibilities. Would that include the United Nations, UNESCO, other kinds of agencies?
I think it most likely would involve space agencies from other countries. But the products of this collaboration could be useful for all kinds of folks, including UN agencies.
I'm Matthew Hartog. I'm with Stanford Medical School. and an amateur sinologist. I grew up with these pictures of the Politburo standing on the dais there, and they always called them the Sphinx. But the Chinese Sphinx is eminently more Sphinx-like. How inscrutable. How close are you or any of your knowledgeable friends to understanding the Sphinx of Chinese leadership?
I'm not even in the ballpark. You know, we do have a data point that I think can maybe open the window a little bit. And the data point is this 2007 debris-causing ASAT test. Now, the Chinese had tried to do this successfully earlier and didn't get it quite right. And of course, our intelligence community was well aware of these preparations, the failed efforts and the preparations for what was to become a successful effort. And our government chose not, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think our government chose not to engage the Chinese leadership ahead of time and say, are you cognizant of the consequences of this test if you are successful? Are you aware of what might happen? And the dangers it could pose to Chinese manned spaceflight and Chinese satellites, let alone everybody else's. I believe we chose not to do that. And we could speculate about why. So the test happened. And initially there's silence from Beijing. And people who are amateurs, amateur space watchers and satellite watchers are following the beginnings of the debris consequences. And you can tell when a satellite, which should be here, is no longer there. People can do this. You don't have to have a clearance. And so obviously word gets out. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry is silent. And it was silent, how long? 2 weeks? It was silent for 2 weeks. And finally issues a statement. A lot of people are upset. Issues a statement. It calls it an experiment, a test and experiment. PLA is silent. So I have some friends who are sinologists and who go there and talk to people to try and find out what the civil military aspects of this were. Robert Gates's memoir says that he thinks the Chinese leadership was in the dark. My friends tell me that's not true, that there was a briefing about the anti-satellite program in general and the capabilities that were being developed. Did the Chinese leadership, we all know this, yeah, it's so important to know what questions to ask. Did the Chinese leadership ask the military, what are the debris consequences of this test? I don't know. I have a guess, though, that they didn't. Would it have changed the test? I mean, the PLA felt the need, I'm sure, to demonstrate this capability. Would it have changed? Would they have chosen another target with fewer debris consequences? After the Chinese tested, we tested a very agile missile defense system against a dead satellite that was about to enter the Earth's atmosphere. So there were very short-lived debris consequences, but I think we made a point in that test. Supposedly the test was done for public safety reasons because the satellite had a full tank of nasty chemicals because it was a failed launch. But I have a hunch it wasn't just for public safety purposes. So there are ways to test capabilities without creating debris effects. I think the Chinese are now doing this, and we have these capabilities too.
All our questions have been coming from the left side of the room, but I'm pleased to see that the right side of the room is now responding as well. I don't want Michael to get the wrong impression that Berkeley is a leftist bastion.
Dean Wilkening from Livermore National Lab. My question is about how to avoid a conflict that destroys satellites in space. Your arguments about code of conduct seem benign to me. It sounded like earlier you were making a deterrence argument. Both we and the Chinese are vulnerable. Both we and the Chinese have capabilities, whether they're dedicated or other capabilities to destroy satellites, risks of escalation. Therefore, it's not likely to happen. The problem with that line of argument, it seems to me, is the asymmetry of dependence on satellites. In other words, if it does escalate and U.S. and Chinese satellites are in some sense equally destroyed, that would have a much larger impact on U.S. military capabilities than Chinese if the conflict is around the Chinese periphery, say a naval engagement. So I'm not sure how much comfort I take from your arguments before that this mutual vulnerability and reciprocal capability to do each other harm in space is going to prevent the destruction or prevent the escalation of a conflict that leads to the destruction or disablement of satellites. So if you could clarify that.
You are absolutely right, Dean, that there is an asymmetry of dependence. Every year that passes, that asymmetry closes. So we are now looking at a number of Chinese space launches annually that is very competitive with us. If you look at relative dependence on space compared to GDP, there is actually rough equivalence. Now, if you look at
Space or a fraction of GDP that comes from spacefaring activities? I'm not sure which.
I'd have to reread this was from Gompert and from Philip Saunders' book. I think it's what space contributes to GDP is actually kind of we're about there, and that too will shift as Chinese dependency on space grows. So actually, I could flip your argument a little bit by saying every year that passes, Chinese vulnerability grows to try and reinforce my deterrence point. But the deterrence argument rests on a mutual acceptance of escalatory risk. And that also depends on the relationship between civil and military authority, which is a black box to us. So we can't depend solely on the deterrence argument. There are other things we need to do. Resiliency, disaggregation of satellite capability. You know, there are some things we can do at the margins to make it harder to do damage to key satellites. We've got lots of ways to respond if the need arises. We need diplomatic engagement, which we do not now have on these issues. So, you know, that's my answer. There's one more thing, and that is that the Chinese tactics that we worry most about, access denial, area denial, also they're space dependent. It's not as if they have a free ride in carrying out their military plans if they decide to do so.
Hi, my name is Mary McVeigh. I'm a student at the Public Policy School here, where I'm lucky enough to get to study with Michael Nacht here. And I was curious about your hearing at the House Armed Services Committee, and I apologize that I didn't watch it, but I have not yet. What did you walk away as seeing as the main congressional interest in the subject, and more importantly, any intent in the future?
Well, the interest was in highlighting China's what's called counter space capabilities, their ability to mess us up in space. So the two Republican subcommittee chairs who convened the hearing really wanted to highlight China's growing capabilities to mess us up. And there's a lot of skepticism on Capitol Hill, as Michael can attest better than I, not just to treaties, but even to codes of conduct, rules of the road type agreements that limit, in their view, our freedom of action. So if something limits our military's freedom of action, it's going to have opposition on Capitol Hill. Now, it's hard to set rules of the road when you have complete freedom of action and when you demand complete freedom of action. That's kind of like a non sequitur, because other spacefaring nations will also demand freedom of action if you are. So that's a bit of the flavor of it. But I heard so many echoes that reminded me of the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, just applied to China.
That's on. So hello, my name's Naomi Eagle, and I'm a Peace and Conflict Studies major here at Berkeley. And going back to the EU Code of Conduct, I was wondering if you could speak about what contributions civil society might be able to make to help bring us closer to actually achieving a code of conduct?
So few people even know that this thing's out there. And so one thing civil society could do would be to call attention to the possibility of dead zones in space and how that would affect our everyday lives, let alone the capabilities of our military, which are trying to protect our national security and the security of our friends and allies. It's hard to do that globally when you can't rely on space. So I think the first thing is to call attention to the possibility of dead zones in space. And I think the parallel with, we have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that's huge. Some of you may have explored how that came to be. But we're not going to fix it anytime soon. Call attention to the possibility of a dead zone in space, or the possibility of forever pinball effects based on debris hits with satellites. Did you see the movie Gravity? I think that helped. I think that helped. The other thing is it's hard for the U.S. government to embarrass another major power. We try to avoid that. Government policy. That's why we have diplomats. But civil society is not as constrained as the government. And I do believe that we won't get Beijing to sign up to a code of conduct unless we embarrass them a bit. You say you are a responsible stakeholder. Where are you on this issue? Why don't you support a code of conduct? Why aren't you willing to sign up to this one? I think those are two things that could be worthwhile.
Hi, my name is Summer. I'm a undergrad student here majoring in poli sci and history. And my question is also somewhat related to the civil society we just mentioned. We know that Stimson Center is dedicated to, is a think tank that dedicated to the space security. I'm wondering that if there is like an equivalent nonprofit organization in China that's also dedicated and working with the government to improve space security. And if there is, then if both the government are somewhat reluctant to talk with each other directly about this issue, is there a chance that we can get the civil society part, the NGO part, to convince the government to and actually let the two parties sit down and actually start to discuss about this?
There are workshops. There's a workshop every other year in China that is devoted to space and related military issues. Ballistic missile defense topics come up a lot at this workshop, but it's also an opportunity to talk about space security and the code of conduct. There is interaction. There are NGOs here who are active in this field, not many, but some. And, you know, we all have websites and we all put content on our websites and we all can track who's accessing our websites. So there are indirect ways to get messages across to our colleagues in China. But the most important contacts are between government leaders and military leaders. And that is very hard. The PLA is like I say, they're where the Soviet General Staff was back in the 60s. And that is dangerous, that there's so little communication. What happens when you develop norms, there's a process, it takes a long time, and it's hard to do, but there's a process almost of socialization that comes from communication. Because you start off on completely different wavelengths. If we were on the same wavelength, there'd be no need to talk. But over time, with enough conversation, contact, negotiation, delegations, clearing customs, over time, you get better. Your predictive qualities get better. You get to a better understanding of sensitivities, red lines. Are they thinking? I hope they're not thinking they could do this and there'd be no problem. I hope they understand what the consequences are of doing X, Y, and Z. You get that through this iterative process. And it's happening with NGOs, some, not enough. It's not happening nearly enough between governments and militaries.
Michael's response reminded me that I neglected to mention at the beginning that Michael also is featured on Arms Control Walk online. So he regularly writes in that venue, so you don't have to buy a book, but you can also go online and get his thoughts as well as others.
But do buy books. Don't
Hi, I'm Brandon Van Ryswick. I'm a computer science undergrad here. So I'm kind of interested in the cybersecurity aspect of all this, and that if I wanted to kill satellites, you can just go up and turn on all the reaction control vents, and now they can't change orbits anymore. And that seems to kind of be China's style of cybersecurity and cyber attacks. Is that more of a concern than like direct kinetic kill stuff, or not?
Would you hand that microphone over to Michael? Cybersecurity is a big, big, big concern. We're definitely not on the same wavelength on that subject. And my hunch after the recent revelations of the NSA's capabilities is that the Chinese military think they're playing catch-up ball. I mean, we've got capability too.
I'm Cadet Yurov with UC Berkeley Army ROTC. My question is related mainly to the economic relations between the U.S. and China.
Great question.
China's our biggest trading partner. I was wondering how you perceive that trade to continue or possibly change pending the current interspace competition.
Thank you for asking that question, because that's such an important aspect of this. And it's a huge difference between the Cold War and today. Because we had next to no economic interaction with the Soviet Union. So there was no connectivity there, no restraints related to commercial win-win situations. There was no mutual hostage relationship having to do with economic ties. There was just a mutual hostage relationship having to do with nuclear. So if we switch to China, we have this mutual hostage relationship with economics, trade, finance, that we didn't have before. You would like to think it's a restraining factor, but you can't depend on it. You can't depend on it being a restraining factor. But it's something we got going for us now with China, I think, that didn't exist back in my day.
I was wondering if you would want to comment on oh, I'm sorry. Frank Rettenberg, chair of the Marin chapter of the World Affairs Council. I was wondering if you wanted to comment on cultural issues. I think overcoming Chinese mistrust of the West in general, not to mention the United States only, is a work of decades. It's my impression that Chinese children are educated in the exploitation of their country by the West in the 19th and early 20th century. They're encouraged to participate in demonstrations against the Japanese when there's an argument over 2 or 3 silly rock-like islands. And just from my own experience as a former Foreign Service officer, I always found it easy to communicate, to enjoy myself with Russian diplomats, helped by a little vodka, of course. And the Chinese were always much more distant. You would meet with them, but there was a sort of barrier there to any communication. And I think that has to present problems, particularly, as you've noted, with the General Staff PLA liaison.
Yeah, strategic affairs can't be divorced from cultural affairs and cultural understanding. But you know, there's so many Chinese students here. That's good.
But they're young.
They're young, but they're a powerful, powerful force. The potential there is just awesome. So, you know, I'm a neophyte with China. I mean, I've been to China, I'm guessing, I don't know, maybe 8 times over the years. So I'm a beginner. But it was the same way discovering the Soviet Union. Just took it takes a while to build up capability. And the capability to read somebody and understand somebody is way harder than the capability to learn about what their throw weight is or what their satellite constellations are. It's just, you're right. This is the work of generations. But in the meantime, we have to avoid the use of force against each other.
I'm Ray Ho. I'm a student of physics and business here at Berkeley. I was curious about the private space exploration aspect of it because it seems to me that it's relevant because any agreement would have to cover both public space exploration and space projects as well as private ones. So I'd just like your comments on that.
You know, the satellite industry does not have a seat at the table for these talks about a code of conduct. But the administration has reached out to satellite industry to familiarize them with what we're trying to do as a government to create rules of the road. My sense in talking to industry is that the number one concern is, will this cost us more money? Will there be a regulatory burden? I think this applies both to the old satellite industry and the Silicon Valley new wave industry in space. The answer is that responsible behavior in space may indeed cost you money. So instead of using the last 2 gallons of gas for your satellite to pull X number of additional money-gaining maneuvers before your satellite dies and becomes an obstacle in whatever orbit it resides, you use that gas, so to speak, the fuel, to get out of the way, to park in a safe place and not become a debris hazard and make way in that slot for a newly functioning profit-taking satellite. So sometimes responsible behavior costs more and requires more of you. I am of an age where I remember where the automobile industry took exception and opposed safety measures for the automobile. You know, seat belts and airbags. They were extra costs of assembly. And now, you know, that's okay. Nobody argues with that. And those costs are built into our transactions. So I think the analogy is that if a code of conduct comes into being, there will be some additional burden to mitigate the debris consequences of what you do in space and how you launch, and also this parking problem that we are having in some areas of orbital endeavor.
Couple more questions, and then we'll break for our reception.
Hello, I'm Jared Hazelton. I'm an EECS political science double major, and 2 questions somewhat related to the talk. One was a lot of your previous papers from, say, 2003 and 2011 talk about the implications of soft power in space and the unique feature that that provides in areas like the ISS, but a lot of the talk has focused on issues such as we are cooperating with Russia on the ISS now, even though relations are sort of stagnant. I'm curious how that doesn't really jive in a sensible kind of manner, if you get what I mean. It seems to me that issues of space don't seem unique to overall relations and or do not spill over to cause a positive effect. They just lead to these compartmentalized scenarios such as cooperating on the ISS. And second is, you talk about the code of conduct, but you've also mentioned things like the Wolf Clause, which bans cooperation with China bilaterally, and other issues such as Congress opposing it, but also the PLA being different from Chinese over-the-top leadership and their CMR relations. I'm curious that even if the code of conduct was implicated or was initiated, what proof or what reason would there be that it would be even sufficient, even though something's better than nothing, or arguably so? How would those issues be implicated by the code of conduct? How would it resolve any of them?
Right. You may be right about the lack of spillover effect. So yeah, we cooperate every day on the space station. Does that spill over? I have to think harder about that. And I don't have a methodology where I can point to broader consequences. I really have it's more of a gut instinct than a provable method. So there were times during the Cold War competition in space where things were really troubling. There were 60 of these anti-satellite tests, a little bit more than 60. A lot of them were unsuccessful. So it's not as if there were not troubling things going on in space. Now, 60 is a small number compared to nuclear weapon tests. So there we're talking 1,000 plus. But 60 is not a trivial number. Strategic Defense Initiative, concerns over Soviet space activities. You can go into the library and pull out these documents called Soviet military power that the Reagan administration put out every year. A lot of it would be on space. And, it could stand your hair up on end. And yet, worst cases were avoided. I have to think, even if I can't prove, that the cooperative parts of our relationship with the Soviet Union in space were helpful. They certainly weren't harmful. We could argue whether they were neutral or helpful. I tend toward the helpful side of things. What was your other question?
Even if you were able to put the code of conduct.
Oh, you're right. Okay, got it. I think the answer, one way to answer your question is, how do we develop norms of responsible behavior when there are no enforcement mechanisms? So we have traffic regulations. We have the California Highway Patrol. We've got local law enforcement. They can pull you over, give you a ticket. So we have rules, we have norms. You're supposed to drive on the right-hand side of the road, stop at stoplights and stop signs. We have laws and we have enforcement, and yet we still have reckless driving. Okay, so now let's look at space, where we really don't have enforcement. We just have payback. And we're trying to set norms of responsible behavior, knowing that people can break them, which is why we have capability for payback. So after this Chinese ASAT test that created this humongous debris field, there was hope that nobody else would do that again. Yeah, there were these tests in the past. The 6+ years ago, the Chinese did this. Nobody's done it since, at least not in that way. Do we have the makings of a norm here? Well, one requirement is that everybody understands how dangerous and indiscriminately dangerous this practice is. So we get something to work on, because all spacefaring nations have equities that are placed at risk. But if I wanted to clarify a norm, and I don't have a treaty to do that with, then one way to strengthen a nascent norm is by means of this code of conduct. And there are other ways too, declaratory statements. I promise never to do this again. Unless, I'm fighting a war, in which case the norms change. I don't know, there are different ways to reinforce norms, which is what I'd like you to think about in this case.
One final question.
I'm Gabriel, a history major here at Cal undergrad, and one of my main questions is, who do you see taking the initiative in creating enforcement and creating these, I don't want to use the word, maybe detente with China, because we see the U.S. and the East Asian pivot, but yet it seems more militarily, instead of getting to the peace table and creating relaxation with the open seas. And that's just my main question. Who do you see creating initiative?
It's very hard to promote a relaxation of tensions with a major power if it's not a bipartisan effort. So if the political parties, as represented in Washington, are not on board a diplomatic initiative with a major power, it's really hard to sustain. So, the Nixon administration made the breakthrough with China. It made the breakthrough with the Soviet Union in terms of nuclear arms control. It made the breakthrough with Moscow in terms of space. But within a decade, the impetus for détente was in very bad shape. And when a Democratic president, one that I worked for, tried to pick up this banner and move it along with the Soviet Union, the Republican Party had shifted and was deeply skeptical of the enterprise. Indeed, even before President Carter took office, his predecessor, President Ford, stopped using the word détente in public. So fast forward to China. The Wolf Amendment was mentioned, the one that bars bilateral engagement with Beijing for certain parts of the U.S. government, including NASA. I think this is yet another example where the sharp partisan divide reduces the freedom of action of an administration that wishes to open doors in China. I mean, the PLA is a tough, tough door to open. But it's even tougher when you have members of Congress saying, don't even try. And that's a fair, that sentiment is a significant sentiment on Capitol Hill.
Before we adjourn, let me also mention another program that IIS sponsors, the annual Sanford Elberg Lecture. And on March 19th, we'll be having George Packer, staff writer for The New Yorker, speaking on The Unwinding, an inner history of the new America. So I encourage you to attend that. That will be in the Sudarsha Dai hall of the Banatao Auditorium over on the far side of campus.
He's fabulous. He is awesome.
Michael, thank you very much.
Yep,
You're
my
awesome as
pleasure.
well. And please join me in thanking you.